Well, Michelle Grattan, good morning.
Good morning.
Welcome to Cooper Lodge, the University of Canberra's most recent student residences, on a rainy but welcome rain day in Canberra.
Indeed.
Now, last week we talked extensively about Arthur Sinodinas, and we should pick this up again briefly because he appeared before the Independent Commission Against Corruption yesterday, presumably a day that he didn't entirely enjoy. But I should stress that he's not actually been accused of anything. You conclude your column today by noting Tony Abbott's strong support for him and saying if there's no significant adverse finding, but there's still some criticism of Arthur Sinodinas, will the Prime Minister be able to bring him back into a finance portfolio, do you think?
I think this would be a real dilemma for Tony Abbott because Arthur Sinodinas really did not perform very well at ICAC yesterday. He couldn't remember a whole lot of things. It was quite clear that he didn't perform his director duties in such a way that was diligent enough to find out various things that were going on in the company that he should have known and should have acted upon. And altogether, he came across as someone who you would think should have had much more acumen and didn't. Now, he is Assistant Treasurer. He stood aside from that position while this inquiry is on, but he would go back to that position if there was no adverse finding. You have to ask yourself whether an Assistant Treasurer needs to be more across detail than he's shown himself. On the other hand, this is a previous position he was in. This is not happened while he was a parliamentarian, and as you mentioned, Tony Abbott is very loyal to him. I think Tony Abbott's dilemma would be that Arthur Sinodinas would be very vulnerable politically if he came back into that job after everything that's happened. But for Tony Abbott, it would be hard not to bring him back. So that's the dilemma he would be in.
So perhaps we could turn to the economy directly. We're possibly being softened up for an increase in either the rate of the goods and services tax or the scope of it. The outgoing Secretary to the Treasury, Martin Parkinson, has raised it, possibly with the acquiescence of Joe Hockey. Glenn Stevens has this week called for a conversation about an increase in taxes. In the long run, is there any alternative to an increase in taxes if it's actually a government revenue crisis that we have?
Probably no, there is not an alternative, although of course this government always says it wants to bring down taxes, not put them up. So that's a difficult concept for the coalition to be willing to accept. Certainly what we're seeing is the beginning of this conversation, but it's coming from a senior bureaucrat, from the Governor of the Reserve Bank, rather than the government itself. The timing is a bit awkward for the government because this, of course, has been the week where we're running up to the WA Senate election, and it's difficult in another sense too because the government's white paper on taxation won't be ready for another 18 months. So this conversation really is going to get into full swing in the latter part of the government's term. The government has said it will take any changes to the next election, which would be a particularly hard ask in a way if it's not travelling all that well by then. In the immediate term, though, I think that what the public will take out of this is the GST is back on the agenda. Now, the government is trying to say, no, nothing is being contemplated, which is true, but the signals mean that people get alarmed even if there isn't anything imminent.
Well, in the short term then, if they want to close the budget gap, they have no choice, presumably, but to cut expenditure.
Yes, that's right, and we will see spending cuts in the budget. I think they will be somewhat skewed to the later part of the forward estimates rather than the immediate term because the government doesn't want to stifle economic growth too much, so there is a bit of a balancing act going on there. But we are hearing day after day really from Joe Hockey about the escalating health costs in the medium term, problems in all sorts of areas, the pension bill going up, the disability scheme being very expensive. So clearly there is a conditioning process going on here. It's a question of how much they do and when they do it.
Well, Michelle, you've mentioned the WA Senate election. There are 6 Senate seats up for election this weekend. I can't not ask you what your prediction is and whether it's actually going to matter for the complexion of the Senate.
Well, if you talk to the parties, they're pretty reluctant in these last days to predict, so I think I'll follow their lead and be reluctant too. There's a lot of agitation by everyone around this Senate election. The major parties, say Clive Palmer is spending twice the amount that they are combined. They are agitated about that. There were some votes mucked up by the Electoral Commission this week in a nursing home. Those people have been asked to vote yet again. Couldn't have been a worse story for the Electoral Commission, which is already under fire, of course, for causing this election in the first place. I think that if the election threw up a win by a micro-party again, then everybody would be really beside themselves, because there's still worries about the micro-parties, although some people say that the public is more turned off by them this time. And as for the voters, well, the message is coming loud and clear that the voters are just over this. They've had one election too many in WA. They had a state election as well as the federal election in the last year or so, and they are lethargic, angry, and may not turn out in great numbers. That adds an element of extreme unpredictability.
I think I share their pain. But we have 3 weeks now without these interviews. I'm going to China as part of the mission there, possibly as a dot in the crowd. We have graduations and the Easter intervenes, but I look forward to resuming our conversations at the beginning of May. Thank you, Michelle Grattan.
That'll be good, and have a great trip to China.
Thank you.